Good afternoon. We'll have a few more people trickling in. So welcome to our second panel discussion on the private sector engagement track. On this panel, we will be discussing new business models and approaches, primarily in the electricity markets as relevant to this region. So we have a lineup of great speakers. Their bios are on the app, so I'm not going to waste time reading that out, and I would straight away start off with the presentations. Over to you, Divina. Working. You have to hold while speaking all along? Oh. Really? Okay. I'll put a phone on.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Divina Chingpanco from the USAID Energy Secure Philippines. USAID DSP is a $34 million project funded by USAID, of course, and we were officially introduced in November 2020. We're supposed to operate within 5 years, so we're ending in November 2025. The major goal of the Energy Secure Philippines is to enhance the country's energy security and reliability, considering now that the Philippines is now a unified power system. So Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao is now interconnected. USAID ESP is organized into 3 sub-objectives. We're working closely with selected distribution utilities in improving their utility performance. We are advancing renewable energy systems and hopefully introduce new technology. That is our second objective. And the third objective is the last phase of what we would call the power sector reform law, meaning enhancing competition in the power sector. So our ultimate goal is to assist the government in contributing 500 megawatts of renewable energy into the generation mix, mobilize $750 million in private sector investments. And under ESP, we have what we call a grants under contract mechanism, wherein we provide grants to even startup companies or small companies. That's where they do, pilot tests, new innovation, working closely with local organizations, and we also provide grants to academic institutions. So competition has always been one of the pillars that underpin the successful implementation of the power sector reform law in 2001. Actually, we just passed the law in 2001, and we bravely launched our wholesale electricity spot market in 2006. Learning lessons from that, we started launching, Visayas and Mindanao. And recently, we just launched what we call the spot market in Mindanao. So DOE basically provided the policy, and the Energy Regulatory Commission, of course, policy is useless without the regulatory framework. So policy first, and ERC comes in with the regulatory framework. In a landmark ruling, in 2019, the Supreme Court basically mandated all distribution utilities purchasing electric power supply for the captive market, meaning you don't have the power to choose. Say, for example, in Metro Manila, it's Meralco choosing for us where they would buy power from. So basically what the Supreme Court said was, you cannot basically enter into a contract without a transparent competitive selection process. Supreme Court actually put it way, way more dangerous. Well, probably don't quote me on that, because they nullified all contracts signed in 2015 that has not really underwent the CSP. So DOE is really determined in ensuring that we achieve the energy transition pathway. The National Renewable Energy Plan is aiming for 35% RE by 2030. And for the first time, DOE launched what we would call the Green Energy Auction Program. JRAP, or what we call it, the Green Energy Auction, is not new. I mean, it has been done in other countries. But this is the first time, that the auction was done in the Philippines, and it was in June 2022. It, it is actually a very simple IT platform, like it mimics what I would call personally a sealed envelope bidding. It was a nail-biting experience for us because, like power outage can happen and then suddenly they cannot submit their bids. The links are gone and the developers are going to complain that they cannot submit their bids. So, but if you see that the most of the bids actually tended towards what we would call a price cap. So in the auction, ERC also regulated the price, meaning you cannot bid beyond a maximum price. But if you tally all the bids, most of them actually were at the gear price. And despite, the hesitance of RE developers on what we would call a new technology for the Philippines, out of the 2,000 targets, we netted out DOE with our help, 1,866 megawatts of RE capacity, equivalent to around $2 billion of private investments. Coming at the heels of this successful green energy auction, the DOE now has become more ambitious. So now in the next few weeks, there will be a second round of green energy auction. And we're aiming for 11 gigawatts of RE. If that becomes successful, then the Philippines would have achieved already its 35% of RE, which is supposed to happen in 2030, will happen in 2023. I hope I did not jinx it, but based on the previous conference, there were a lot of qualified suppliers who basically were interested to really participate in the auction. So wait for the announcement. It will be happening probably in the next, hopefully 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So one of the issues that the distribution utilities face when, the DOE really became more aggressive by increasing the renewable portfolio standards from 1% to 2.5%, effective, I think, next year, 2025. So what is RPS, or Renewable Portfolio Standards? So from 1%, it became 2.5%. So all distribution utilities or mandated participants, you are mandated to procure at least 2.5% of RE from your total portfolio. So if you're a distribution utility that is fully contracting from conventional fuels, you have to find a way to source 2.5% from your portfolio. DUs don't have the ability, especially electric cooperatives, not just to do competitive bidding, but track their RPS. So USA DSP, building on what the DOE developed as Excel models from the power supply procurement plan, we developed what we call a smart buyer toolkit. Hopefully they really become smart buyers after the toolkit. So the smart buyer toolkit will just help the DUs analyze, okay, I have 5 bids from our RFPs, request for proposals. And I need, so much percentage for my base load, so much percentage for my mid-merit, and I need only a certain percentage for my peaking. So what's the best combination of these bids that I can come up with? So that's what the Smart Buyer Toolkit is supposed to do. It will also help the distribution utilities defend themselves when they face the Energy Regulatory Commission, when they put forward for approval their power supply agreement. At the same time, it helps them track their compliance to the RPS of, if you only have now 1%, no, you have to find a way to do 2.5%. So competition is really the underpins, the power sector reform. And for those who have been following the Philippine electric power industry, 2 decades after PIRA, because the power sector was reformed in 2001. It's now 2023. We're at the cusp of what we would call the last phase of the era. We are hoping households now will be empowered to source their power from the generators they want. In 2021, ERC promulgated what we call the aggregation laws. You know, aggregation meaning households can aggregate together and then pay. So we developed what we would call CREM, but the biggest feature in the CREM, competitive retail electricity market, was what we call an RES scorecard. So what is the RES scorecard? Households don't understand, competition. They do not know who to buy from. So we're going to hopefully assist them. The RES scorecard rates licensed RES and it's very transparent. So it's your ability to provide information, how much is your rate. So it's actually in the website that you can see this RES is selling for $1. This RES selling its generation for 50 cents. But price should not only be the criterion, right? It has to have after sales support, like we have what is your customer service. So those are factors that actually are also being rated under the RES scorecard. So my presentation is really based on technology, using technology to advance renewable energy. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks, Davina, for making best use of the regulatory framework, launching new technologies to enable, and maybe catalyze the transactions in this thriving framework. And over to Anand, who's working to create that environment in other geography. So please feel free to send in your questions on the app. So the app has this feature.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anand Chikatur. I am the Chief of Party of the Vietnam Low Emissions Energy Program, which is a phase 2 of a 10-year program that USAID has been funding to Vietnam, supporting the Ministry of Industry and Trade. I want to basically give you a very brief overview of how the VLEAP 2, as we call it, goals and objectives are set up. We also have 3 main objectives, kind of similar to what Davina presented earlier. The first one is to increase the deployment of advanced clean energy technologies. The second is to improve the energy sector performance. And the third is to increase competition in the energy sector. Most of our work is really aimed at improving the enabling conditions in Vietnam to help support the deployment of advanced technologies, particularly renewable energy technologies in Vietnam. Our previous program basically supported 300 megawatts of clean energy to come online in Vietnam under the feed-in tariff program. And in this new phase, we are expected to support the mobilization of finance for about 200 megawatts, 2,000 megawatts of renewable energy. Okay. So here I'm going to be basically talking about a new framework. It's not so new for many of you who've been here at ASEF and following what's been going on at Vietnam. Since 2017, 2018, the U.S. government, USAID, and the VLEAP program has been working to support the government of Vietnam to develop a direct power purchase agreement, also in some other places known as a corporate power purchase agreement. So I'll give you an overview of that and talk about how we have been pushing along that line and the changes that needs to be done. So first, just as a background, why do corporations actually purchase clean energy? A lot of this is for 3 main reasons. The first one is because they may be actually mandated to do so from the countries that they're operating at. They may have corporate commitments. Many of the large corporates whose logos you see here really have corporate commitments to their shareholders that they're going to be purchasing renewable energy for all of their, for all of their own use, but also for supply chains for these companies. Secondly, it actually makes a lot of good business sense because it provides long-term financial contracts will really allow you to purchase clean energy at a low price. So to support this, there's been a number of institutions, organizations that basically support the clean energy purchasing for corporates. So there's the RE100 group, there is the ACT group, there is the UN Alliance for Sustainable Fashion, and then there's the SBTI. These are simply organizations where many companies participate in, either following the specific standards or helping themselves make it clear to their shareholders that they can actually purchase or that they are in the process of purchasing renewable energy. So there's basically 6 ways in which you could do that. Just going from the bottom, you can actually generate your own electricity on site on your own solar rooftop, for example. You can purchase carbon offsets. You can buy renewable energy certificates, which you will hear about shortly. You can, of course, improve the energy efficiency and reduce the intensity of your products. You can sign on to green tariffs, or you can do corporate or direct power purchase agreements. Okay. So what is a corporate or a direct PPA? Basically, it's a long-term contract, it's a financial contract that the consumer agrees to purchase electricity from a particular company rather than going through a local power utility. It's basically a financial contract, or it's often a financial contract. It allows for low upfront costs, long-term revenue and price certainty, and it increases grid usage and reduces the fiscal impact. And it can also decouple generation and consumption locations. So that's how a financial contract here basically works. Now I want to switch a little bit to specifically about what we've been doing in Vietnam. So first, why the direct power purchase agreement in Vietnam? This is a mechanism that's been requested and demanded by the private sector. So the interest in the DPPA really came from power consumers. More than 40 global companies have, signed on to RE100, and they have commitments for their operations in Vietnam. The renewable energy project development community has also been seeing this as an opportunity, a new mechanism by which they can actually develop new projects, especially after the feed-in tariff program has ended. In 2016, there was a Made in Vietnam energy plan, which was put out by the Vietnam Business Forum, and the DPPA was their #1 recommendation for what the government should do to support corporates and project developers in Vietnam. The government itself has been listening to this. They understand the need for FDI investors to basically to promote renewable energy, to secure renewable energy, and so they understand the need for DPPA, especially at the highest levels, the highest political levels. And since 2017, as I mentioned, USAID VLEAP has been really leading a lot of this work, in leading the public-private collaboration and working with the electricity regulator of Vietnam to make this happen. In general, the DPPA program really fits the requirements and the goals of both the public and the private sectors. So what have we been doing since 2017? We've been helping the government designing the DPPA program. We've been really working with them in evaluating international experiences, identifying different models, and the financial impact on the power market. We also established the Renewable Energy Buyers Working Group in Vietnam, and this was actually done in partnership with the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator. So this was a way in which we could build the support, share information back and forth between the government as well as the private sector. So we really sort of help bridge design requirements from the private sector as well as legal and institutional constraints that the government of Vietnam has, and really did a lot of surveys and worked very closely with the private sector to design a legally valid program in Vietnam. So going forward, this is not yet done, but we hope that it'll be done very shortly. WeLeap continues to gauge the market interest, identify other areas for support, and to provide inputs to both the government and the private sector for successful implementation. So the declaration, we actually had a corporate DPPA declaration back in 2017. And in 2019, we actually convened a formal public consultation where we had senior officials from the US government as well as the Vietnamese government participate in these events, showing the high level support for both Vietnam as well as the US government. So at the moment, the framework and the associated government circulars, the wholesale electricity market really are being discussed and they're being updated. And we're really hoping for a final approval sometime this year. So this is the current version of the DPPA mechanism as of May 2022. Basically, what you have is a consumer and a generator enter into a contract for differences between them. That's a private contract. And then the RE generator, the solar and wind developer, sells the power to the wholesale electricity market, and they get the wholesale electricity prices. Then the power is sent into the Vietnamese network, the grid, and then the EVN Power Corporation basically sells the power to the consumer. The consumer at the moment, the way it's structured, is that actually the consumer pays a retail price to the power corporation, which includes all of the wheeling charges as well as the price of the wholesale electricity. And then the consumer then separately has a contract for the contract of differences with the solar and wind developer. So this framework is going to be updated shortly. And I want to basically leave maybe a few thoughts for the rest of the Southeast Asian countries here as to what we can learn. First, in terms of commitments, the main reason for why the DPPA is where it is today, although it's not yet complete, is that this was really driven by global firms. They really pushed for this to happen. And then companies really need really strong commitments, and especially commitments to decarbonize their supply chains. And that's really sort of the key element. And the government themselves has to be supportive of such a policy. So the DPPA is only just one specific solution, but it's a solution that really works. It requires a lot of coordination, active support for the government as well as from the government. And in general, we believe that this program that the Vietnamese government is going to finalize soon is really going to be persuading both the project developers as well as I would say the FDI investors to continue to make their investment in Vietnam. So let me just leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anand. May I invite Natsuko-san to go next? Wherever convenient. Yeah, when you want to do from there? You need the speaker.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good afternoon. My name is Natsuko Toba. I'm at the International Finance Corporation and World Bank Group. I'm the lead author of this work, but I'd like to also introduce my co-author, Turaj, Luis, and Anupama.
So first, I wanted to give you some changing the context of the electricity market in many countries. First, policy about 30 years ago, it was much more emphasis on competition. Okay, the objective remains the same. Objective is to provide the right price signal at the right investment at the right time to deliver reliable electricity to the consumer at affordable price. The objective remains the same. The market is getting a little bit, the emphasis is getting different. About 30 years ago, it's much more on the competition, privatization, deregulation, and then the target service fee like FIT. But currently, it's more emphasis on climate and other environmental and social governance issues in ESG. And then also the subsidy scheme become more competitive subsidies like auction rather than the earlier feed-in tariff, fixed feed-in tariff. And also even the contractual difference is getting different because before it was a support to the competition in the market. But as the electricity, so the renewable energy getting lower, it's become more on the market creation and the benefit sharing. And the market, in the wholesale market, in the country with the wholesale market, the most of the dominance of thermal technologies with the dominance of the variable cost. And then also the highest marginal cost clear the price. Currently, wholesale market, the renewable energy have a very high capital cost and a low variable cost. And volatile prices due to variable energy is getting very different market future now. And then about 30 years ago, the climate change is mostly addressed by gas. For example, in England, there's a dash for gas. And then gas provide nearly 24/7 all the time, the dispatchable, on-demand energy. And then most of the countries, there's no subsidy incurred for the CCGT or the gas power plants. And then some of the ESG is like the large hydro, they have some ESG impact. But now, variable renewable energy, even with the battery battery storage, it's very difficult to give a 24/7 on-demand energies. And then subsidy is very important because of the high capital cost. And then also ESG impact on the remote location of critical mineral because of the renewables. And the investors also changed because about 30 years ago, the climate ESG is more on outside profit, like a corporate social responsibility. But now they wanted to increase in the investment and the market. For example, the morality in the competitive market is becoming increasingly important, and the profit and welfare, and for example, climate ESG maximization is part of the investment objective. For example, like sustainable linked investment financing, and then the corporate many. Just like earlier speaker talked about, corporate mandate or voluntary mandate for the renewable energy power purchase to have a 24/7 with tracking is becoming very emerging interest. And the consumer also is changed. Before it was a passive, just getting energy, but more on active participation in participating in the energy market, like demand response and solar rooftop, for example. So that is a context in changing this market. Sorry, for next. So what is the challenge in ASEAN and East Asia in this currently changing context of market is that like the Vietnam and even Cambodian government increasingly export-oriented firm are subject to voluntary or involuntary climate as a ESG regulation. However, many of the Southeast Asia, the grid energy has a lots of, I wouldn't say lots of, but quite a lot of fossil fuel. And over 40% is coming from coal in Southeast Asia. So it's very difficult to use grid energy. And then also in East and South Asia, coal-fired power plant is quite young, 10 to 15 years. So this is a kind of challenge they're facing. So in ASEAN and East Asia, there is a very diversified market. Some of the countries like Japan, Korea, Singapore, and also in the Philippines as well, there is a competition in the market, in the wholesale energy market. But some of the countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, and PDL, they are still state-owned single buyer model. So, but how we can introduce competition in this single buyer model is we can introduce competition for the market by auction for the bidder to compete in the specific market segments under the power purchase agreement. So that's our focus here. And then renewable energy power purchase agreement challenge still remains because of the variable energy. It's very difficult to provide on-demand energy, 24/7 renewable power. So energy storage addition to the renewable energy in auction will improve the transparency, like tracking in climate and ESG compliance in enabling investment in clean and dispatchable capacities. And then this is very becoming official interest. For example, just a few months ago, the United Kingdom government called for proposal or evidence because they wanted to include the non-price components like employment, innovation, industry, and ESG in a contract difference in auction. So that's the reason we are focusing on how we can incorporate externality and ESG climate objective in a competition and provide 24/7 energies in auction, because some of the country in ASEAN does not have a wholesale market. So key summary of this study in a presentation, we are going to present a few more. Is the one we are going to briefly summarize the theoretical conceptual framework for the auction market, where the demand and supply have their own ESG objective, investors, but also consumer is increasing to purchase clean energy, right? And then what is the auction risk? And what is the auction among other policy instruments? And what would be the business model existing? And then what is the ESG risk mitigation and the management? Oh, sorry, it's over.
He's trying.
Okay, so
in the next couple of minutes, please.
yeah, okay, so I just so some of the things I want to just one issues because I wanted to provide some suggestion for the auction design for the core challenge. So we could do, you might remember in about several years ago in the spectrum auction in the United States, actually the Paul Milgrom won the Nobel Prize. It's built on that idea. So multi-state, you can see in the bottom in the incentive framework, we could do the state product matching auction. So first is a reverse auction to determine price at which, how much basically the coal-fired power plant is willing to give up for the early retirement. And then the capacity is going to fill it up. And also the avoided CO2 emission is avoided. So this first round, they will provide how much price, how much they can give up and at which price.
And the second round is that the CO2 buyer, carbon buyer, how much they are willing to pay to purchase CO2. So first round, as you see it, there's a huge difference between how much they can sell carbon and coal megawatt. And so it's a quite, it doesn't supply and demand much. So there will be a second round. So the higher seller have to go, or even the capacity limit, fixed capacity going to be reduced. Then the remaining some, they can give up at cheaper price. And also because the CO2 limit availability is shortened, so the buyer going to pay more. So the few round, and then finally the supply and demand match. And then we will get how much CO2 is avoided, and also capacity is freed up. And then third auction is solar or any wind to have an auction, renewable auction, because now the capacity is freed up for the solar. So many governments say that, oh, we cannot increase the renewable energy because we have already committed coal power plants that are existing. But this could be a possibility that they can plan ahead. So that is one of the things. I think we have a go over time. Yeah, business model. Okay, so yeah, I'm happy to share this presentation and also the paper too. And the business model, there's a merchant is more on a country with wholesale markets. And then they are much more dispatch model is much based on decision is much based on the system demand. And then the next model is a peak load reducer, because some of the utilities, again, this is more on the unbundled markets. They need to pay for the transmission operator for the capacity cost and also meet, yeah. So, but having a solar and the battery, they can reduce the payment for the capacity peak load payments, and also the rest of the batteries and energies they can also sell at the ancillary service market. And then the third is more on incentive participant that is benefited from the government feed-in tariff and energy attribute certificate to become a fully commercialized solar PV and best business. However, some of the downside is that because they need to follow the requirements to become eligible for grants and then some tax credit. So that is sometimes limit. For example, in the US, to get the credit, they need to discharge from the twinning the solar 75 to 100%. So it's this kind of requirement really constrain to benefit the full benefit from the hybrid solar and BESS model. And then much more, yeah, that is also relevant to the single buyer model, is that the one in DPPA, the reduced electricity payment, because some of the countries have a higher for the commercial and industry tariff. Having a solar PV and BESS business model, they can also not only the electricity payment, but also the capacity charge, because they can reduce the capacity charge, and then also increase. Yeah, so I just stop here, and then last one. Yeah, so basically, the, how can I say? Yeah, so I just wanted to say cost and benefit on this risk management, and then what can be avoided. And then because now the investor is very interested increasingly interested in ESG and climate. So as you can see in the sustainable linked financing, they are willing to transfer their private profit to pay for this cost. That is obvious in the ESG financing. And the case study, Thailand actually did from a renewable auction, and some of them actually came from the hybrid or co-located PV and BESS. And it's really a time differentiated. And then, conclusion for the benefit of the speaker. Yeah, sorry for this long.
Thank you. Lot of stuff covered there on best business models. That's something evolving and of interest to all of us here. Over to you, Rauli.
Great. I'm just waiting for the slides to pop up and then we'll start
Next
rifling
slide.
through.
Next slide, Seth, please.
Well, first of all, I'll start off by thanking everyone for coming and staying through the day. My name is Roble Po Velasco Rosenheim, and I'm going to talk about a very complex idea in very simple terms. So we're going to talk about renewable energy certificates, and we'll dial that in and look at what opportunities project developers have in APAC. You guys are saved by the bell. I will not go into transaction volumes, but if you have specific questions on that, I've got slides that we can rifle through at the end, right? So let's start off with just a basic overview of RECs, right? And in its simplest form, a renewable energy certificate or a REC is basically just a serial number that's telling us where our electricity comes from, right? Now, for this to make sense, it's helpful to sort of look at what a grid concept looks like or what a power pool looks like before RECs come around. And essentially on the left-hand side, you see different IPPs producing power using different kinds of energy, right? All of those electrons have essentially no color. They go into the physical grid, and the end user on the right-hand side of the power pool doesn't really know where their electricity comes from, and they certainly can't make sturdy claims as to how they've pulled in that power, right? So the REC or the EAC, the guarantee of origin, is a very simple serial number based on a system called book and claim. So when the power is produced on that left-hand side, 1 megawatt hour of power, wind power is being generated. We, the IREC Standard Foundation, slap a serial number onto it, and the electrons still go into the grid. This also operates under PPA models and rooftop leasing, and I'll get into that. But the punchline, or the important part of the story, is that the end user on the right-hand side can then make substantiable claims about where their electricity is coming from, right? So again, to draw that in, a REC just tells us where our electricity comes from. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but not by much, right? And so you'll see an IREC REC on the bottom and in the middle, those two images, and you see the ownership document that I have for my motorcycle in Bangkok. That's the green book on the right-hand side, right? Essentially, RECs function in much the same way. They are not the physical electricity, but they're an ownership document that allows you to make specific claims. And they do that by capturing factual information, which we refer to as attributes, right? So the first piece of information that a REC captures is basically 1 megawatt hour of power was produced using a specific source of renewable energy. That second bullet point tells us the second, third, and fourth facts that are captured, which is when that megawatt hour was produced, where it was produced, and who did so, right? The third bullet point down is a fact about facts, and it's essentially saying all of the above information has been captured using a specific set of rules, right, which we refer to as a standard, and that's what the IREC Standard Foundation does, is it develops those rules. The last bullet point is perhaps most important here, which is saying once you've captured all of that information, you can ascribe ownership to that information. That allows you to transact it, to sell it, or to claim use of it. Along the bottom, I've got other names, guarantees of origin, that's the system used in the EU. RECs is used in North America, and EAC, or energy attribute certificates, is generally the widest term we use, right? These are the typical sources of demand for RECs. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail because we've had colleagues describe it. I'll point out first the CDP, or Carbon Disclosure Project. About 2% of global companies by market cap are reporting their electricity consumption to CDP. if you are an entity that is reporting clean electricity consumption to CDP, you must track it and substantiate that with RECs. And that includes under power purchase agreements. That includes if you're doing generation on your own rooftop. This REC is really just that green book to my motorbike, the ownership document that says I own these green bragging rights. All right. I think it's interesting to look at the demand perspective. And in order to do that, I like splitting it into two components. First, why are corporates interested in renewable electricity? I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. And then we'll look into why specifically the certificates, right? I'm a firm believer in the pure economic argument. So you'll see my third bullet point down says, oh, it's the right thing to do. I'm sorry, I don't believe that that genuinely motivates corporate action. I think that the biggest motivator, at least 10 years ago when RECs transactions started really coming out, was showing business leadership. So these are some of the early joiners to the RE100, companies that, essentially CEO wakes up on one sunny morning in California and says, we're going to be a business leader. We're going to go out and decarbonize to 100% renewable electricity consumption. A year later, you see that growing quite a bit, right? And so these are some of the world's largest, most powerful entities. And I genuinely believe that they're doing this for pure economic reasons. Some of the business leaders come out first. Following those business leaders are the companies that need to survive and compete, right? So that's that first point, pure economic. The second one, price hedging. So if you're doing forward purchases under a power purchase agreement, again, you're not doing it for the warm and fuzzy feeling it gives you. You're doing it as a price hedging mechanism and potentially to get in front of policies that are, to get ahead of policies that'll be coming later, right? So we found that the early corporates that started doing these transactions, certainly in Vietnam, are at the table discussing this with policymakers, with regulators. And so there's a real rationale. So that's why renewable electricity. In terms of why RECs, right? A lot of project developers and brands will come to us and say, look, we've got the solar panels on our roof. It's clearly there. Why do we need to use the certificate, right? Even in physical transactions, you need it for reporting purposes. They're not our rules. There's someone else's rules that says if you want to substantiate that that electricity belongs to you, you better have the ownership document. The seller's perspective can be summed up in a few words. It's all about the money. You guys are welcome to have this presentation once I'm done. These are different kinds of REC vendors. So everything from IPPs, utilities, who I spend most of my time with, commodity brokers. Every entity that's a seller or a vendor of RECs is doing it because it helps them earn money. That's money that goes back into the project development process, period. So we won't dwell on that. Specific opportunities in APAC, and I'm coming to the conclusion, so don't get too stressed. If there's one thing to remember from this presentation, it's that RECs are not just an unbundled instrument, right? So what are the opportunities in APAC? Different transaction models. Unbundled transactions and bundled transactions are important to split out, right? An unbundled transaction means I buy my electricity from the grid, and it can be brown power, it can be gray power, whatever it is, and I go to a completely separate vendor, probably a commodities broker, and I buy this certificate separately. This is essentially me offsetting that electricity consumption with green bragging rights. There's some criticism about that. I'm more than happy to talk through it. I myself am often allied with the criticisms of it. So that's an unbundled transaction. I think more important for the people in the room, particularly donors, but also project developers, you should be thinking about bundled transactions and how to work with large corporate off-takers on delivering physical electricity and delivering the RECs. This is taking place currently in the Philippines. It's taking place currently in Vietnam in different kinds of bundled transactions. So not the DPPA yet, but rooftop structures. And it's something that we can talk about the logistics more. If you have questions, I'm happy to talk through that. The last point on bundled transactions, this is something that can become very attractive to utilities as selling green power even to households. We've seen tremendous success on this model in Malaysia, where TNB is essentially supplying 4 million megawatt hours of clean power to small consumers and essentially helping medium-sized companies decarbonize their operations, while the larger entities that have stronger purchasing power and can build new projects are doing bundled procurement through PPAs. This is my last slide, right? So these are the things that I think we should all be getting excited for, right? I think that one of the biggest shifts that's taking place in the market right now is that procurement models are changing. 5-10 years ago, the vast majority of these transactions were unbundled. So you go, you buy your power in a normal way, and you go out and you sort of deal with the trader and buy these offsets. That's fine, right? But if we're looking at sort of increasing ambition and doing genuine impacts on the grid, going out and doing bundled transactions can really reshape a power system. Price transparency, I mean, by far, the most common question that I get is how much are these things worth? I'm not allowed to talk about that at all because we deal with buyers and we deal with sellers, and any opinion that I'll have could influence that. However, there are market and transactional platforms, essentially what would look like your over-the-counter stock options that are really quickly increasing price transparency. If you're a buyer and you're interested in understanding how much you should be purchasing these for, I think that these marketplaces are a good place to start, at least to get a sense. From a procurement perspective, the buyers are changing, and this is unlocking a huge amount of demand. So we're moving from primary brands, these are Fortune 500 companies, into a space where their supply chains are having obligations to do procurement. If we look at the load profile spread across specifically Southeast Asia, but also broader APAC, brands are just a little piece, right? And their supply chains are this huge, huge depth of electricity load under that. So this means a lot more demand, a lot more targeted demand can encourage a lot of new production. The last thing that I'll sort of leave as a question for people to play with is whether we should open up market borders and what that would look like. I have personal views on this. The foundation does not. But currently within Southeast Asia, the REC transactions are taking place within a single country. Not our rules. These are set by Greenhouse Gas Protocol and RE100. From a technology and implementation perspective, this is a very, very easy thing to address. But getting there is going to require that governments shake hands and agree on essentially allowing these transactions to take place across borders and doing appropriate carbon and residual mix calculations across those borders. You've got my contact details here, and thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you, Robin. Actually, you ended on a note which directly ties in with some of the questions that came in. So the first question, and this, I'm going to blend two questions here. It says, are RECs the same as carbon credits? How are RECs included in organizational GHG inventories or in product footprints? And another pretty similar question was, what is the difference between buying RECs and buying carbon certificate in carbon trading scheme? Additionally, what would be the enabling environment for RECs? So I think these two are pretty similar questions.
Great. Well, thanks for that and for the questions. Couple of fundamental differences, right? First is, what are we measuring? So a carbon credit is looking at an avoided ton of CO2. And that avoided is a really important word. That's something that's going to happen in the future, right? So avoided ton of CO2, that's a carbon credit. REC, Renewable Energy Certificate, is a measure of a fact that has taken place in the past, right? I produced this electricity. I certify that that happened, right? There's a lot of criticism of carbon credits because of recent projects that have gone wrong, right? So a nice example of this huge project in Africa was generating about $100 million a year in revenue based on the prediction that a forest would have been cut down. You spend money on these carbon credits, and we believe that we can prevent it from being cut down, right? That's an ex ante or predictive model for making an environmental attribute. The REC is completely different in that it's looking at something that's taken place in the past. So that's one of the two differences. To your question on how they're used in a reporting context, put simply, corporates are reporting against three scopes. One is the emissions, scope one is the emissions that they're putting directly into the atmosphere, right? Scope two is what you're getting with your electricity. How much carbon did my electricity come with? And scope three is everything else, right? You can only use a REC for scope two. I bought this much electricity. It had this carbon intensity coming in from the grid. I buy a REC and I address that scope two. And carbon credits you can use loosely for scope one and scope three, but that's often criticized.
There's one more question which you partially answered, which is under the corporate PPA, which party is claiming for carbon credits, which could be generated by RE plants, or there are RECs being generated and used? What are the specific provisions in the PPA?
Thank you very much, right? So, I mean, a couple of ways of looking at this. First of all, and it's important, you get either a carbon credit or a REC. for that power you're generating, right? If you're entering a PPA, let's forget about the sleeve. Let's forget about wheeling for a minute, right? Let's just think about the two parties, power producer and off-taker, right? Typically, you've got the responsibilities for the producer are the actual electricity generation and delivery, right? And you would typically transfer the same responsibilities for the REC production and delivery. So you've got grid infrastructure moving the physical electrons, and then you have REC registry infrastructure moving those green bragging rights, right? So it's typically the project developer's it's required that the project developer register the project, they go through the KYC, they request issuance of the RECs, and they receive them. They put them into essentially their online bank account, and then they're responsible for delivering those over to the corporate. From a registrar's perspective, this can be done in a lot of different ways, but it is important essentially at the contractual level to assign who's doing what under that structure.
Cool. Actually, there's a related question, but I think that'll lead Divina to also kind of get some more insights. But Divina, there's one question which says, who are the off-takers for the RE under GOP? And maybe that'll also help us kind of phrase it in the light of REC.
Yeah, for the Philippines GEOP, Green Energy Option Program, first long as you have an average consumption of 100 kilowatts and above, you can participate in the GEOP program. You have to participate through what we would call a licensed GEOP supplier. And most of the licensed retail electricity suppliers can be also participating and helping you participate.
Please, yeah, and how does this tie in with the REC's discussion that we just heard from Rob?
Yeah, I have a question for Roble. I think REC is not a new concept in the Philippines. We've been talking about that for probably more than 7 years already, ever since, we passed the renewable portfolio standards. One of the issues that was widely discussed then was, why would you allow a private company which chooses to buy 100% of its power supply from conventional fuels to buy itself out by just buying REC? Meaning you're just buying REC, but you're not really committed to really moving towards energy transition. That's one question. My second question is, the Philippines has always been touted as, having the most expensive electricity in Asia. It's a huge debate if I go into that, but the point is we're allergic to cost. So the issue is, based on your experience, what's the cost of the RECs? What's the range of cost in RECs?
All right, so if I've understood, so the first question is, why would we allow corporates to basically offset electricity consumption with RECs? And the second is, how much are they worth, right? So the first one is a great question, right? And I think if you look at this, there's different layers, right? So the people that set rules on what a corporate is allowed to do, there's a couple, right? It can be governments, but for the voluntary market, this is generally set by a series of standard setting bodies, right? The main one is Greenhouse Gas Protocol for Scope 2 accounting. They've historically said, sure, you can go one for one conventional electricity with unbundled REC certificates. And the jury's out as to whether that's doing enough, whether that creates enough impact. The foundation doesn't have a stance on this, right? We're not here to say you're doing a good transaction, you're doing a bad transaction. We're here to track the transaction, right? It's worth noting that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is currently being rewritten. It'll be a 1 or a 2 year process, and they're looking at exactly that issue. Is this enough ambition to put on corporates? Are we doing enough? Are we requiring them to do enough? And the way that from a tracking perspective, you would solve for that potentially is putting different labels on. So you could say this REC comes from this fuel type and was delivered under a bundled physical PPA. And that would essentially signal corporate having done the most they can. And then for sort of small and medium-sized buyers, I've got a small consultancy. We don't have that much load. I can't afford, solar on my roof. That's sort of the best I can do, is go out and do REC procurement. So that's sort of the who should be allowed to and why. The price question is limited to national borders, and within Southeast Asia, we've seen REC prices for under $1 per megawatt hour, right? So there's not a huge value adder, to upwards of $70, $80 per megawatt hour. These are supply demand factors. In North America, for example, in the US, we've seen compliance and voluntary markets operating in parallel. Where you do that, you can artificially drive up the price of a voluntary market REC by increasing prices in the compliance system. So there's all sorts of mechanisms that governments can use to play around with that pricing. But prima facie, yeah, I mean, less than $1, upwards of 70, 80.
Thank you, Roland.
Now, I would want to kind of see how Vietnam is getting prepped for RECs.
Thank you. This is a new format of panelists questioning each other. I like it.
I make my job easier, have them spar.
So, Roble, I spoke about the direct power purchase agreements, and part of the mechanism there involves renewable energy certificates. Effectively, the DPPA are creating bundled RECs along the lines of what you described. Can you share a little bit about, where you think Vietnam is going to be in, or where Vietnam is now, and where Vietnam might be in a few years' time with respect to RECs?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth starting off by saying Vietnam is an active REC market. Don't quote me on the numbers, but I think that there was somewhere in excess of 5 million transactions in the IREC registry in Vietnam for the 2022 vintage, right? So there are a lot of unbundled transactions. I think that when you look at this from a policy perspective, and this is, it's possible to avoid some of the potential mistakes that have taken place here. It's very important to ensure that corporate buyers of that physical electricity have access and the legal right to use a tracking system that they can use for reporting purposes. And I'll give you an example in China, right? China has its national REC system, and it is not approved by CDP. It's not approved by RE100. And that means that a corporate buyer, and they can choose. They can do IREC or Tigers or the GEC, which is the Chinese system. But there are other policy structures here, for example, that say you must use a specific tracking system. If you force corporates into a space where they can't satisfy reporting requirements, you come into a place of hurt, right? So I think that from a policy perspective, make sure that you allow flexibility in the corporate procurement and use of different instruments.
Yeah, thank you. I've always wondered how I should, or me or Deloitte Consulting can find a way to green ourselves with our electricity. So basically what you're saying is that I need to buy unbundled RECs in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's available to you like today. There's a list of brokers and traders active in Vietnam, and that transaction is very easy to structure, perhaps too easy, right?
Yeah, it's also interesting to kind of explore the hybrid model that we just saw, hybrid BESS model. And Natsuko-san, what do you see the connect there with RECs? Is it going to change things, or do we want to know more from Roble on that?
Yeah, thank you. We understand that most of the compliance market in REC is based on source of generation, regardless it's filtered through BESS or not. So despite the effort and the investment in BESS to provide firm dispatchable energy, they are not counted in REC. So what do you see that the investor and developer have to keep in mind?
Yeah, and I mean, this is something that is like a real issue in the REC space, right? Is that they're typically based on point of generation, right? We were talking about this conceptually earlier, and I went and sort of did my homework on this. And I am aware that from a tracking perspective, RECs can be adjusted to basically do a double movement. So you'd timestamp it at the point of physical generation. You would retire it against a battery energy storage system at the point of injection into that. And then at the point of dispatch from the BESS, you would essentially remint and then redeem for that beneficiary. So I think that 24-hour matching and timestamping is a critical issue. It's something that RECs need to be able to catch up to. And I think that there's a lot of sort of layer 2 solutions built on top of our infrastructure that's allowing that, all in support of essentially getting higher granularity on 24-hour matching and pairing that specifically with BESS storage. I'll point out that if that's something that anyone in the room is particularly interested in, Google put out a case study on this recently for work that we were doing with them in Chile on 24-hour matching. I don't believe that it brings BESS into the picture, but it's something that would sort of be an important next step. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Robley. That's an interesting perspective for us to think. I would like to move the spotlight on Divina now. Divina, there's a question from the audience which says, can under GOP or otherwise, can corporate power purchase agreements be used to conduct RE auctions? And maybe, Chris.
Yeah, I think so. I think, like we have an active, you're looking at the green energy auction, right? So it's the auction itself is not new. Like big utilities like Meralco, they do their own auctions. This is probably the first time that the Philippines did the auction. And what is new is it uses an electronic dashboard that supposedly ideally is transparent. Many other countries are more interactive. I've watched other countries, how they did their auctions. You can see the price bid. But I think the Philippines wants to take baby steps on the auction. So while it's transparent, it's going to be very simple and for the users to be able to understand. There's, as I said, Balaji, there's a lot of corporate interest in the upcoming auctions, and we hope we get to achieve the 11 gigawatts. And I think the biggest really objective is to bring down the price. So we need more bidders in order to bring down the price.
So Divina, let me ask you a question on that. It's great that the auction process in Philippines is ongoing. The government has taken a strong leadership. Could you tell us a little bit about two things? One is the next steps and actions that's going to be taken to implement this. This is already in the second phase. And then both of us lead USAID funded programs. So it'd be very interesting for me to learn about how the USAID program in Philippines is basically helping support the implementation of this auction program. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Anat. I think when you bid and you basically become part of what they would call successful bidders, it's not automatically that at the end of the relay, you actually are going to be awarded what we call a certificate of award. So there's a case under auction 1 wherein the actual bidded megawatts 1,966 megawatts, but the actual end bidded megawatts was only 1,866 megawatts. There are 3 more steps, successful bidders have to overcome. And one of the biggest hurdle they need to overcome is performance bond. Performance bond is equivalent to 20% of your total project cost. If you don't get to submit that and show you have your performance bond, you are eliminated from the first round. So that's one. We're supporting DOE not only in the drafting of the auction design document, the development of the IT dashboard, training the DOE on that, but we're also supporting private sector who are part of the auctions, meaning they already successfully bid out and they have this delivery period in order to reach their finish line. So we mentor them, what we call the private sector transaction advisory group. There are several steps that we need to do in order to help them. The Philippines has so many rules, regulations, and navigating them would be really, really very challenging, especially if you're only working within a short period of time. So that's what our mentoring menu is all about.
I'm going to sort of pick up on the point on your support for the private sector, noting specifically this smart buyers toolkit, which I'm going to end up looking more into. But so there, to my understanding, there's 2 REC systems now in the Philippines, right? There's the voluntary market, and that's IREC, and that's its own thing. And then there's the compliance market, which is designed specifically for feeding into the RPS, right? So in the GEOP context, right, what can buyers do? Like, can they choose which system? Do they have to do compliance? Do they have to do voluntary? I think that certainly for any clean electricity buyer, that would be a pretty relevant question. So I'm just wondering how it works.
Yeah, in theory, we have what we would call the REX, which is actually happening under the GEO, meaning the DUs, if you're part of the green energy option, not the green energy auction, this will be the end users now. So your RECs go to the distribution utilities. I guess it's a way to incentivize distribution utilities to really, help an end user trying to buy their own power. But unfortunately, we don't really have what we would call a regulatory framework in order to make it work. Make the renewable energy market work or make the RECs work in the sense that there's a cost to compliance. Meaning, if you're mandating me to meet my RPS, and we're talking about the private sector now, but I don't have a way to really pass on my costs. I don't know how to be able to recover it. So there's a regulatory framework that is being done in there has to be harmonization between the policy and the ERC. For the JOP, the end users, it's so pleasing to know, that the peak demand as of March 22 reached 76 megawatts. So that's also the reason why there is an aggressive push for 11 gigawatts because we don't want to make it more attractive and then we don't have the capacity. But unfortunately, there's a very little sector of the market that really understands the GEO. We're supposed to be developing what we would call a website for GEO, meaning information, and then support DOE and ERC on a roadshow. But only want to make sure we have the capacity once the interest is so high. And of course, the regulatory framework, right, for you.
Cool. Going to BESS and hybrid models. So Atsuko-san, do we want to explore the potential in both Vietnam and Philippines? Philippines with the ongoing GEOP and
Can ask both Vietnam and the Philippines. This is a different format. Okay, so what do you see in the Philippine markets and then Vietnam to see any emergence of either standalone BESS or hybrid coming out? And then do you think that the buyer willing to pay for the extra for this little bit more firm energies coming out? And then also, is it possible to install in existing project as add-on, which is actually recently the huge surge of increase in the hybrid in the US is many of them are coming add-on in AC coupled hybrid. So do you see any add-on coming and also any change in the PPA feed into the GOP?
Thank you, Natsuko. For the Philippines, I think we have what I would call a very high level of interest for battery energy storage system. In fact, the government just launched this very big BESS probably 2 months ago in Bataan. So the issue now is the Department of Energy issued a new policy in April 2022. And BESS, you can categorize BESS either as a generator or a load. So depending on the connection, depending on the use, everyone though is waiting for the regulatory framework. So if I add, BESS to my current system, say if I'm a DU and I want to be able to increase my reliability, my energy security. Remember, the Philippines is an archipelago. I mean, we don't have countries where we can just import power when a big power plant is down. We just have to make sure we have ancillary services to really, make up for the power that is lost. So even the users are thinking about that. We're also small islands. So I guess for me, Natsuko, I'm going to throw back the question. given all the interest in BESS, how important is BESS for us? Given that we're an archipelago, we have small grids, small islands, small communities, what do you think is the best use of BESS for this country? Yeah, I'm asking you.
In the Philippines, in the archipelago, and a lot of thousands of outer islands, I think most of the, especially in the social impact, is very beneficial for the small outer island because they need to, because for example, in the rough, also in the Pacific Island, like Tuvalu, and when the sea graph, and if the relying on the diesel power plants, sometimes the rough sea, it's very difficult to transfer by boat. But having a little bit battery and the solar, they can have a little more energy securities. And then also to maintain, we can always monitor through the communication, I mean the satellite, so digital communication system to see the corrosive nature of the solar panel. So that is more benefit to the remote island and marginalized people.
Thank you.
Okay, so to answer your question about BESS in Vietnam, this is really a very hot and interesting topic in Vietnam right now, partly because, as you know, Vietnam has signed the Just Energy Transition Partnership, and a BESS project, a pilot project, is something that many of the development partners are suggesting that Vietnam support as part of the JETP activities. So, but that said, for a long time, we have not really had the regulatory framework, or actually the legal framework, allowing for BESS to be legal in Vietnam. And the good news is that the Power Development Plan 8 was approved on May 15th, last month. And in that PDP 8, there is actually significant mention of energy storage in general and battery energy storage in particular, with a focus on both solar and wind utility scale, as well as rooftop solar. With regard to rooftop solar, there's a lot of focus on behind the meter self-consumption oriented rooftop solar. And they do talk about how commercial and industrial BESS should actually be used with the solar rooftop when the cost is affordable. And similarly, they talk about how the utility scale solar and wind projects should also have on-site battery energy storage to basically support the reduction of congestion on the transmission system. Okay, so all of these are good signs now that there is actually a legal framework through the approved PDP 8. BESS is in principle, at least now, allowed. Now, the issue is, of course, converting what's in principle and legal into something that's actionable and implementable. That requires, similar to Philippines, a regulatory framework, both in terms of technical standards associated with putting a battery energy storage both on the grid as well as connecting to the distribution network for the commercial and industrial users. So in my view, I think BESS is a very key element of supporting the greater penetration of solar and wind. But there are challenges in the technical standards and regulatory standards that will soon be addressed. It's going to happen quickly. But you did raise a very interesting and again, and somewhat controversial issue about what happens. Can you add, can you retrofit a BESS onto a solar and wind project that's, for example, receiving a feed-in tariff program, right? So under the feed-in tariff program, Vietnam has installed a significant amount of solar and wind, both for rooftop as well as for utility scalar. But now if you add on a BESS, you could potentially be generating power I mean, you will still be using the same power, but you could spread that power out over time and reduce curtailment. But the real challenge has been that the feed-in tariff PPAs do not actually allow that. So right now, it's not structured for them to be using the BESS and retrofit that. So this is an active issue. This is an area that at some point I think is gonna come up, but it's an area I think that's gonna come secondary to the primary situation where new projects are gonna be the ones that are using BESS, not necessarily the retrofitted ones.
I think that this kind of regulation have to change. And also I think many of you know that even like EU and the United States, the regulator already established the market rule for battery or energy storage, but not for the hybrid yet. So it's a new area.
So I'll just take this, stay on this topic of controversy with BESS, just in case it's like this transmission level BESS. Then who do you think is best suited to own that? Should the system operator own it, or is the transmission company to own it, or distribution company to own it? And why?
Depends on the purpose and also depends on the demand, right? Because the nature of the energy storage and battery storage can be serve the load, as she said, but also the capacity, but also ancillary service, but also for the generator, for example, because some of the markets, they have a balancing penalty. So generator need a balancing. And also if the utilities, they also need to save for the peaking investment, right? So it's a very different. And transmission, yes, also have the battery or energy storage have the transmission service, the grid service. So it's really depends on the purpose and also how many durations they want it. Because currently lithium ion is only 2 or 4 hours maximum, and 6 is very expensive. So other than that, you need to have a pumped hydro or some thermal storage, and thermal storage and like redox flow storage is not really widely commercial yet. So it's a challenge.
Cool. So we have exactly 4 minutes left, and I just thought I'll have each of the speaker quickly summarize on the big themes of the new business models that are happening before we end this session. And all of us can go for a drink at the cocktail reception happening at the cafe here. To you, Robley, why don't you get going from that end?
So you want a summary of basically our takeaways, right? Okay. I mean, for me, I think that I like ACEF because you have a lot of policymakers in one place. And I think that there are some very serious risks to corporate procurement in the region right around the corner. I think that nationalization of REC systems has shown itself to be problematic in a number of countries. I'm not suggesting that it should be liberalized or done entirely by the private sector, but I think that in general, instrument of use should be the buyer's choice. Right? This is something that is a pressing issue right now in the Philippines. It's something that was an issue in China. It's something which could potentially become a very big issue in Vietnam, particularly as the DPPA comes through. So I think that that's, for me, the takeaway is buyer's choice in the kind of certification scheme that they use. And then I guess a message for project developers is if you're not currently, if you're generating clean power and you're not in some way monetizing your RECs, you're leaving cash on the table.
I think one of the issues I didn't have time to mention is in auction in general, not to mention the auction that address the ESG issues, has a huge, quite a lot of non-realization risk. So many auctions, and even they don't sign at the end of even the winners. And some of the reason is that underbidding, because less regular auction give uncertainty. So they have risk taking and then underbid. And also the cost increase, and then also some ESG issues like a community development issues. And so there are many issues on the non-realization risk. Some of the mitigation measure is that the financial qualification, pre-qualification, so that they can have a commitment, and also the penalties, but backed by the financial pre-qualification. So that could be the one of the also the shorter duration, so that they can avoid the change in the cost. So that is what some of the things that they can avoid the non-realization risk. And then, yes, if increase the high financial qualification and also the physical qualification and the penalty, they may increase the bidding, bid pricing. But if we increase the competition, the participation, that also competitive pressure also offset the increase in bidding price. And then another things, especially in ESG incorporation, is that, for example, like ESG incorporation, innovation, and the local industry development and local employment, it's very too much for just one project to have develop the local industry or innovation. So it's really need to have a complementary instrument and a policy to complement the achievement of the ESG or overall increase of the welfare.
So I think there's basically 2 points that I'd like to make based on the experience with the DPPA mechanism in Vietnam. First, I think the project developers from the private sector actually have a very big and important role to play. They were always sort of, viewed as taking advantage of regulatory framework as project developers to install clean energy, but they're also now sort of demanding clean energy, and the approaches, whether through RECs or carbon markets or DPPAs, I think that they have an important role. But the second point is that the governments are not going to move at the same pace as what the private sector wants. There's lots of regulatory framework, legal issues that needs to be resolved. And so I think the expectations need to be a little bit more tempered, and they need to have, the private sector needs to have a little bit more patience with governments as they go through the process of making the change. This can be sometimes hard. Not everybody has the patience, but I think that there is significant benefits for private sector who do have that patience and is willing to stick through and support the government. So it's really a dynamic where it's a bit of a push and resist kind of approach, but one that I think is going to be beneficial in the long run, both for the governments as well as the private sector.
I guess my colleague summarized everything very well. I'll just add one point. I think what is so heartening for us is you can see the increased opportunities to empower consumers. So now there's a lot of opportunities, platforms wherein end users have a role. And hopefully it gets traction in Asia so that we households and users could now have a voice in order to really decide how we want to do our way of electricity. So
Thank you all. This was great discussion. I had very little work to do. I just let them spar each other. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, so we had the first session was on PPPs and some solid demonstration of actually successful PPPs. This was also like a lot of work in the enabling environment, as you can see, to bring in new business models, the kind of work that we need to do. And the next two sessions, which are on Thursday morning, are actually on financing and on incubation in the private sector. So yeah, please come back for those sessions. But in the meantime, just go chill, get some beers at the cafe. Cheers. Thank you.